Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you all for coming or coming back to our ongoing lecture series on microbiome diagnostics and microbiome therapy. This is the third of our 3 lectures, and we're delighted to have had such a stellar series. I'm Susan Wolf. I'm the chair of the university's Consortium on Law and Values in Health, Environment, and Life Sciences. And this series has been jointly sponsored by the Consortium, the Biotechnology Institute, which is led by Mike Sadowski, and the Microbiota-Therapeutics program, which is jointly led by Dr. Alex Koritz and Mike Sadowski. We have, again, a wonderful program today. Professor Diane Hoffmann from the University of Maryland Law School, who I'll properly introduce in a second, who will speak on microbiota-targeted therapies, from probiotics to transplants, new regulatory challenges. So finally we get to the law and what the FDA is or is not doing and others in this space. She's going to speak for about 35 or 40 minutes, and she'll be followed by our faculty commentator, Professor Francisco Diez-Gonzalez, who I will also properly introduce when it's his time to speak, who'll talk for something like 7 to 10 minutes, and then we'll sit over here living room style and engage with all of you. There are mics on both sides, so be thinking about your questions and your comments when we get to that point. This event is being videotaped again because we're putting up on the Consortium for free public access all of these lectures. The first 2 are already up. So please share them, use them for teaching. They're great resources. Silence, if you would, all your cell phones and electronic pagers and other devices. For those of you who are looking for CME credit or CLE credit, you have to complete a participation form, and those are all out at the desk in the hall. So grab one of those. Other health professionals can submit a statement of participation to their appropriate accrediting organization or state board for consideration of credit. And if you have any questions about all that, please feel free to consult our wonderful staff. They're very expert on this. I would like to thank them because none of this happens without their tremendous expertise. In particular, Catherine Grimes and Jeanette Gagnon have really taken the lead on this whole series. So many, many thanks to them. An evaluation form is going to be emailed to you very quickly after this conference. And if you wouldn't mind just taking 5 minutes to fill it out, we really do value your feedback. We read them all, and we then make adjustments. I'm thrilled that there's an adjustment already. The stage is bigger and safer. Those of you who were here before, I've been worrying last time we had one of these chairs at the very edge of the stage, maybe because I'm a lawyer. I was just sure we were going to lose somebody, but we didn't, and now we have a better stage, so I'm less concerned. In terms of disclosures, Professor Hoffmann has nothing to disclose. I disclose that I'm a stock shareholder in Royer Biomedical and LifeSync Holdings. Professor Diez-Gonzalez discloses he's a consultant for 3M Food Safety. Professor Sadowski discloses partial research support consulting fees and royalties from CPAC, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, CIPAC, and that additionally he jointly holds a patent with Professor Koritz relating to compositions and methods for transplantation of colon microbiota, something I'm sure we're going to talk about during the course of the lecture. And finally, Professor Koritz discloses that he too receives partial research support from CPAC and jointly holds that patent. It is my great personal as well as professional pleasure to introduce Professor Hoffmann. We've been colleagues for, maybe we shouldn't count how many years. What do you think? many, many years. She's a professor of law at the University of Maryland School of Law and has long served as director of that law school's eminent law and healthcare program. That's among the many roles that she's played there. She holds a law degree from Harvard as well as a master's in public health. From 2008 to 14, she served as a member of the board of directors of our lead professional society, which is the American Society of Law, Medicine, and Ethics, and served as president of the board in 2010 and 2011. She is a prolific researcher and scholar. I'm not going to invade all of her time by going chapter and verse, but I do want you to know that over the last 5 years, she's really been a leader in NIH-funded research on the implications of the microbiome. She's received 2 NIH grants related to the Human Microbiome Project. The first on the regulation of probiotics, she's going to talk to us about that today, and the second on proposing a regulatory framework for microbiota transplants. Join me in welcoming Professor Hoffmann.
Thank you so much, Susan. It's truly an honor to be here and be able to be part of your speaker series on this topic. So thank you all so much for coming, and I look forward to your thoughts and comments at the end of the presentation. So I think you all know that the Human Microbiome Project has been touted as fueling much research into development of new therapies that target our microbiota. A recent article that I came across on the web when I was preparing for this talk found that there were, from 1900 to 2005, that there were just 7 papers that used the word microbiome in their title or abstract. And then from 2006 to 2010, there were 303, and from 2011 to 2015, there are 4,072. So you can really see how the interest in this and research here has accelerated. The media has also fueled excitement about the microbiome. This is just a list of titles that came up when I Googled the promise of the microbiome and microbiome therapeutics. So what's the basis for all this hype about the microbiome? So I think most of you know that researchers have come to understand that our microbiome does play a role in maintaining or restoring health, and that when our microbiome gets out of whack, or we experience what the microbiologists call dysbiosis, or a disturbance in our microbial ecosystem, that we may become ill or more susceptible to diseases. So the possibility of manipulating the microbiome is introducing or reintroducing microorganisms back into our bodies is thought to be a vehicle for wellness. And I think while there are many different kinds of microbiome therapies are being discussed, the largest market sector, at least for microbiome-related products that claim to improve health, is probiotics. And while probiotics have been available as foods for many years in yogurts and kefir products, probiotics in commercial products has skyrocketed in recent years, and you can now find them in juices and nutrition bars and infant formulas and baked products and fermented meat and dry food products and others, as well as in dietary supplements. And these products make many therapeutic claims, such as their ability to decrease the incidence of colds and allergies, eczema, to help with common intestinal symptoms, to help improve your immune system, and even to help you lose weight, among other things. Another area where we're seeing an increase in probiotics is in personal care products and for the skin and oral cavity. So these include lotions and creams and toothpaste. There's also some studies indicating that the potential for microbiotics to prevent tooth decay and gum disease and reduce bad breath. Other personal care products include a live bacterial spray that can help users cut back on deodorant and soap developed their need to use it, and developed by a company named Microbiome. And sales of that product skyrocketed after the New York Times Magazine featured a story about it in May of 2014. Some of you may have read it. It's about an MIT-trained researcher who at that time hadn't showered for over 12 years because he uses this Microbiome product. We're also seeing a lot of more reports out looking at the potential market for probiotics, and the market analysts are projecting considerable growth, as you can see here, and that's been attributed to more consumer interest in and awareness of gut health. However, these market analysts are also or have some reservations, and particularly about regulations in the U.S. and European Union that may have some significant impact on market growth. Also, while much of the hype has been about market projections for probiotics in foods and dietary supplements, we're also starting to see signs of a market for pharmaceutical-based microbiome products. So this is from another market-based publication, marketsandmarkets.com. They say that the human microbiome market is an emerging market with abundant opportunities, that the market potential is quite large. The factors driving this market include the rising aging population, increasing incidences of lifestyle diseases, demand for efficient and safe medication with no side effects, and treatment of diseases that have having a limited success rate with more traditional therapeutics. But the factors, they say, that are restraining this market include, among other things, government regulation of probiotics. So as of now, there are no microbiota-based drugs, at least that I know of, that have been approved by FDA, but there are a number in the pipeline. A number of them have been developed by smaller startup companies, but Big Pharma is also starting to get into this as well. So despite all this excitement about these microbiome-based therapies, there's still some challenge, as these market analysts allude to, with respect to what we can expect, or researchers and manufacturers with respect to regulations. So as with all new technologies and products, sometimes the existing regulatory framework is not quite a good fit. So that's what I will be addressing in the rest of my talk today. So as Professor Wolf mentioned, my remarks are really based on 2 NIH grants that I've received, the first in 2010 from the National Human Genome Research Institute's under their Ethical, Legal, and Social Issues Initiative of the Human Microbiome Project, and then the second in June of 2015 from the National Institutes of Allergies and Infectious Diseases to look at the regulation of microbiota transplants. So I'll be talking for the most part about the first project on probiotics, because we're still in the very early stages of the one on microbiota transplants. So while I was the PI on these projects, I've had several co-investigators on the probiotics project. They're the individuals in red here. So from University of Maryland School of Medicine, Claire Fraser and Jacques Ravel. From our School of Pharmacy, Frank Palumbo. And from our law school, Jack Schwartz and Virginia Rowthorne. Then for the second project on microbiota transplants, I'm working with some of the same individuals, but also we've added Mary Claire Rogman and Eric von Rosenvinge from our School of Medicine. So the purpose of the probiotics project was to examine whether the current FDA regulatory scheme is adequate and appropriate for probiotics, or whether it over-regulates in some ways or under-regulates. And second, to look at whether FDA should examine a new regulatory paradigm for probiotics, or should keep the current regulatory structure with some modifications. The project funded 3 meetings over 3 years to, as I said, explore the regulation of probiotics. We put together a working group of about 25 individuals who included NIH-funded human microbiome project researchers, legal academics in health law and food and drug law attorneys, government regulators, consumer advocates, bioethicists, and industry representatives. And we've done something very similar with our microbiota transplants project. So the probiotics project, the working group, their work resulted in a white paper that led to several publications. These are some of them. The articles cover much more than I'll be able to talk about today, but I want to give you some of the highlights of what our working group discussed. So one of the first questions we asked the working group was to tell us what might be unique about probiotics that would lead to a potential new regulatory pathway. So some of the things that they mentioned were that probiotics are live organisms that are very dynamic, but that they're also likely to lose viability and degrade under certain circumstances. That dosing of probiotics for therapeutic purposes can be problematic, more problematic than with traditional drugs, as one thing you have to do is you need to know the dosage after ingestion due to viability issues. Also that there are differences that appear from batch to batch when manufacturing probiotics, and this is another big issue that we're looking at with respect to microbiota transplants. And then finally, although the Human Microbiome Project and related research projects are likely to lead to therapeutic, and by that I mean drug uses for certain probiotics, many stakeholders in the field of probiotics understand that most probiotics play a role that's somewhat unlike that of conventional drugs or foods, and what they believe is that or they contemplate the role of foods in preventing or reducing disease and illnesses. So in addition to looking at these unique features of probiotics, the working group also looked at the current FDA regulatory scheme and how probiotics fit. So in doing so, we recognized that probiotics basically could fit into virtually every category regulated by the FDA. And FDA approaches things with this kind of box-like mentality that once you're in one, they decide which box you're in, and then you're regulated accordingly. We looked at several of these different regulatory categories, including foods and dietary supplements and drugs and biologics. Some of the initial issues of concern about the current regulatory framework that were voiced by working group members was that there is confusion often about when an IND, an investigational new drug application, is necessary to study probiotics, and this is a burden or can be a burden to researchers. Also, that the current regulatory framework is focused on the drug model and doesn't contemplate the role of foods in preventing and treating disease. And third, that stakeholders need clarity from FDA regarding the scope and type of claims that can be made about a product, especially regarding structure-function claims and disease or drug claims, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. We also looked at, again, this was around 2010 and 2011, and we looked at the gaps in current research on probiotics. So at that time, we found that there were insufficient rigorous probiotic studies that included a study group, a placebo group, and a non-intervention group. That there was insufficient information about how to measure the effect of using probiotics, and that's still an issue. That there was insufficient comparative effectiveness research between different probiotics and between probiotics and non-probiotic treatments. That there are insufficient large safety trials to pick up adverse events, to identify rare events, and develop safety issues for further study. The specific issues of safety included the risk of invasive disease, the effect on the immune system, gene transfer, and here the concern is about lateral gene transfer, as that's one of the mechanisms for the transfer of bacterial antibiotic resistance. And the fourth concern was environmental concerns. And there was an article in 2010 on the CDC's Emerging Infectious Disease Journal that I think illustrates what might be an environmental concern. So that article reported on the administration of S. boulardii bacteria as a probiotic powder that's given to patients in the hospital with C. difficile. And the authors of the article reported that Saccharomyces fungemia is a severe complication that is secondary to the administration of S. boulardii, this probiotic. In a literature review, the researchers found that 48% of patients with fungemia had received this probiotic, S. boulardii preparation, but another 8% were near patients who had received the probiotic but hadn't received it themselves, so suggesting that S. boulardii administration presents an environmental risk for patients who are not receiving the agents but near someone who is. So in terms of what we know about the safety of probiotics, we looked at the results primarily of a study that was commissioned by the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality in 2009. They commissioned the Rand Institute to carry out a systematic review of the safety of probiotics used in research to reduce the risk of or prevent or treat disease. And in April of 2011, they published the study. The report cataloged what is known about the safety of interventions containing lactobacillus, bifidobacterium, Saccharomyces, streptococcus, enterococcus, and bacillus strains. So the researchers identified 622 intervention studies on probiotics that reported the presence or absence of adverse health outcomes in human participants. And the report authors found that based on reported adverse events, randomized controlled trials showed no statistically significant increased risk of adverse events associated with short-term probiotic use compared to the control groups. But because of the inconsistent reporting of adverse events in probiotic intervention studies, the authors were only able to conclude that the current literature is not well equipped to answer questions on the safety of probiotic interventions with confidence. They also noted in the report that long-term effects are largely unknown and that case studies suggested that participants with compromised health are most likely to experience adverse events associated with probiotics. So the working group, some of the things they took away, I guess, from what a regulatory scheme should consider with respect to probiotics was that there has been a remarkably low rate of adverse events related to probiotic consumption, but they still thought that safety evaluation should consider pathogenicity, infectivity, virulence factors, toxicity, and metabolic activity. Also, they noted that probiotic bacteria are heterogeneous and should be evaluated for safety on a strain-by-strain basis. So we also considered the adequacy of existing regulations regarding the safety of probiotic foods and dietary supplements. And I think one of the concerns that was expressed by the working group was with the safety of probiotic dietary supplements, although this applies more broadly to dietary supplements. So dietary supplements, as you may know, are not required to be reviewed by FDA for safety prior to marketing. The manufacturers must ensure that the product is safe, but they don't have to submit data to FDA about safety. Manufacturers are required to submit adverse event reports after marketing to FDA, but then the burden of proof is on FDA to show that the dietary supplement is unsafe. Now, new dietary ingredients are subject to more regulation. A manufacturer, first of all, has to determine if a substance is a new dietary ingredient, and that's defined as a dietary ingredient that was not marketed in the U.S. in dietary supplements prior to the passage of the Dietary Substance Health and Education Act in 1994. So they have to determine that because FDA doesn't have a list of those. And they have to notify FDA 75 days prior to marketing the substance. And they do have to submit evidence of safety, but they're not required to submit data from clinical trials. They can use historical data. And they're not required to provide unfavorable data that they may have. So these are some gaps that could be addressed to reduce some of the risk perhaps associated with probiotic dietary supplements and new dietary ingredients. The next issue we focused on was the regulation of research on probiotics, and this is probably where we spent the bulk of our time. So some of the things that the individuals in the working group, these were primarily academic researchers that were attempting to do research on probiotic foods for the most part, and some dietary supplements, so that some of the current regulatory requirements imposed on probiotic research hinder research progress and increase cost without improving safety. that probiotic foods and dietary supplements that attempt to take on the role of improving health or treating disease by making health-related claims, and even what's called structure-function claims, have been pushed into the drug category by FDA. Their main concerns have to do with how FDA treats research that's being done on certain endpoints, and also the IND requirements. And before I talk about them, though, I want to step back and make sure everyone has some understanding of the way FDA regulates claims, and it's a very basic understanding. So only drugs can make disease claims, and these are claims that describe the effect of a substance on the diagnosis, treatment, mitigation, cure, or prevention of disease. And that they do require pre-market approval by FDA. They have to go through the IND process, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials. An example would be a substance reduces the pain and stiffness associated with arthritis. Dietary and supplements and foods cannot make disease claims, but there are other types of claims that they can make. So they can make structure-function claims, and those are claims that describe the role of a nutrient or dietary ingredient intended to affect normal structure or function of the body in humans, but no pre-market approval by FDA is required for these claims in the United States. The manufacturer is responsible for ensuring their accuracy and truthfulness, but sometimes enforcement is not great on that particular issue. An example would be promotes digestion or helps maintain normal cholesterol levels. They would be structure-function claims. Foods and dietary supplements can also make health claims, and these are claims that describe the effect of a product on the reduction of risk of disease of a healthy population. And these do require pre-approval by FDA, but they don't require that the manufacturer go through the IND process. They must be supported by significant scientific agreement. An example is use of calcium in the diet on a regular basis may help to reduce the risk of osteoporosis. That's a health claim. Now, there are no probiotic health claims that have been approved, and there are hardly any health claims for anything else that have been approved. There are like a dozen or maybe 13. So this is not a route that most manufacturers or researchers have opted to go because of the burden when they can make structure-function claims without pre-market approval. So going back to their concerns about endpoint. So what's going on here is that because probiotics generally promote wellness, many studies undertaken on probiotics use or would use endpoints that FDA would likely view as disease endpoints. Okay, so then there are a couple of important implications of that. First, the research then becomes drug research and is therefore subject to a full IND. Second, that the research on the beneficial effect of foods and dietary supplements can't be used to support product claims as they will be considered disease or drug claims. So what are the implications of that? So here's an example. There was a 2010 study by researchers at Georgetown University where they tested a fermented milk's ability to reduce the incidence of common infectious diseases in healthy children in daycare centers. Okay, so the study documented a decreased incidence rate for common infectious diseases in the active group by 19% compared to the control group. Under the FDA's framework for claims, this study could only be used to substantiate a drug or disease claim, so therefore making fermented milk a drug, which doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. So as regards the need for an IND, the primary concern raised by the working group was that until very recently, FDA guidance and regulatory activity required almost all probiotics, even food and dietary supplements, to go through the full IND process. And if the product sponsor wanted to make any claims that go beyond structure-function claims, such as health claims, and in some cases for structure-function claims. A number of the members of our working group felt that this position contradicts current law and that this interpretation of the law by FDA would have a chilling effect on probiotic research. So just to give you an illustration that this is really a regulatory challenge for FDA, I want to show you how they keep changing their position on this. So in October of 2010, they issued draft guidance that appeared to define all probiotics as live biotherapeutic products, which are drugs or biologics. including ones being marketed as foods or dietary supplements, to go through the IND process. Then in February of 2012, they issued final guidance that said that the guidance didn't apply to investigations solely to evaluate a live biotherapeutic product's use in affecting the structure or function of the body. Then, in September 2013, they came out with a new draft guidance under a different title about INDs, and they said that INDs were required for trials to substantiate both drug or disease and structure function claims, unless the claims were related to the food's taste, aroma, or nutritive value. Okay, and then, so that really, it's still, the industry and researchers, a lot of academics were very concerned about this and kind of let FDA know that. And then, just in October of last year, I've never seen FDA do something like this, and I've talked to other food and drug law attorneys, and they haven't seen it either. They stayed the section of the guidance stating that foods or dietary supplements making structure function claims or new health claims would require an IND. So the effect of these guidance documents, or what the effect of this stay is that FDA doesn't intend to seek INDs for studies in the stayed categories. So clearly, it's still an area in flux. FDA is looking for comments on this, and still are not fully decided on how to deal with it. But given FDA's general push of these products into the drug category, or at least doing an IND, there's another provision in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that's been problematic. It's called the lock-in provision. And this provision prohibits the sale of a food to which any of the following have been added: a drug, a licensed biological product, or a biological product for which substantial clinical investigations have been instituted. So this lock-in provision potentially prohibits the marketing of a food where the food is studied under an IND prior to marketing, even if the study is ultimately intended to support a food rather than a drug use of the product, and therefore may inhibit manufacturers and researchers from pursuing research that studies the role of foods in preventing disease or improving health or treating disease. And there's a similar clause in the law for dietary supplements. So the working group thought that this provision should be revised or at least interpreted by FDA to allow substances that are not intended to be marketed as drugs or biologics, although they have gone through some clinical testing, to be marketed as foods and made more widely available. Another issue that the working group focused on was the regulatory structure for claims. So the researchers in our working group reported that the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act regulations state that structure function claims will be considered a drug or disease claim if they indirectly or impliedly relate to a disease prevention or amelioration. But that the problem is that the distinction between what's a structure function claim and a disease claim remains very blurry. So, for example, helps retain healthy cholesterol levels is a structure function claim, but helps lower cholesterol levels is a drug claim. Promotes urinary tract health is a structure function claim, but improves urine flow in men over 50 is a drug claim. So the group was also concerned with potential underregulation of claims and under-enforcement of claim requirements. And so, for example, although the law requires claims to be truthful and based on sufficient evidence, lack of enforcement allows some, and some would say more than some, inaccurate and or unsubstantiated claims to reach the marketplace. And that FDA does not have authority to require manufacturers to provide substantiation of claims. So it's interesting that actually the Federal Trade Commission, which also regulates claims under their authority to regulate advertising, does have this authority. They can request the substantiation, but FDA cannot. So that's another, I think, issue that the working group noted that seemed to be something that might be beneficial for FDA. Okay, just lastly, with respect to probiotics, one of the things that our working group came up with that we thought might be a compromise in terms of allowing some types of claims that may be health claims or even what might be considered, FDA might consider disease claims, to go forward would be a probiotic monograph. And Canada already has a probiotic monograph for what we would call dietary supplements. And what this is that they have identified certain microorganisms, you can see them there, and they have pre-approved certain claims. So what that does is limit manufacturers to making only those claims. So it would do away with all the other kinds of claims, which, I think there's a lot of creativity that goes on in marketing departments about what kind of claims they can make. So this might be something that we might consider. The U.S. does also have a monograph for over-the-counter drugs, so it's something that our legal framework is familiar with. All right, in the remaining amount of my time, I do want to touch on our second project, which is about the regulation of microbiota transplants. So what we're doing here is looking at different regulatory options for fecal microbiota transplants, as well as other emerging microbiota transplants, and such as vaginal, skin, anterior nares, oral, and what I call whole body transplants. And we're looking at not only the biologic and drug paradigm, which is what FDA is currently requiring for fecal microbiota transplants, but also looking at other paradigms that are for transfusions or transplants, such as for blood and blood products and cord blood, or vascularized organs, human cells, tissues, and cellular products, as well as maybe the practice of medicine, which gets it out from under federal regulation and into regulation under the states. And we'll be looking at whether the framework, whether it meets certain requirements for safety and efficacy, and providing reliable information to patients and consumers, to ensuring access to patients who need them, and that the regulatory framework doesn't overly burden or discourage research on microbiota transplants, and that it supports public health objectives. So I think, as you know, fecal microbiota transplants for C. diff is currently being conducted and has been shown to be very effective at treating C. diff. The other potential areas of microbiota transplants are still in their infancy, with many hurdles to go through before development of any type of therapeutic interventions. But these are some of the kinds of things that members of our working groups presented at our first meeting. Another type of microbiota transplant is that we may be looking at, as I said, what I call whole body microbiome transplants. And this is where babies born by C-section who are thought not to be exposed to the beneficial microbes that vaginally delivered babies receive are swabbed in their mouth and over their bodies with their mother's vaginal fluids. So we'll be looking at all of these different kind of microbiota transplants. One of the first things that the working group struggled with was the definition of a microbiota transplant, in particular how microbiota transplants are different than probiotics. And we looked at, are they mutually exclusive? Are they on a spectrum with some overlap? Or are microbiota transplants kind of under a broader umbrella of probiotics? So for comparison, the definition of probiotic, which actually FDA does not define, but the internationally endorsed definition of probiotics is live microorganisms that are administered in a sufficient quantity to confer a health benefit on the host. So we gave our working group actually a definition for microbiota transplants as a starting point, and that was that microorganisms transplanted from one human to another, so very simple. But our working group had several issues that they thought needed to be addressed in the definition. So the first thing was need to be much more clear on what is being transplanted. It's not just a few microorganisms. Generally, it's a set of organisms or a community of organisms that has a connotation of interaction, or a system of organisms, because that will probably differentiate it from probiotics. The second issue was the degree of manipulation of the transferred materials, and again, that seems to be relevant to whether the transplant is more like a probiotic drug. So our group acknowledged that microbiota transplants are similar to probiotic therapy in the sense that bacteria are reintroduced or introduced to a human being specifically to impact the recipient's microbial balance. But probiotics are generally cultivated bacteria, whereas at least in the case of fecal microbiota transplants, the transferred material is less manipulated. And may be tested for communicable diseases, may be filtered, may be frozen for storage, but still pretty minimally manipulated. So as a result, the working group thought that something about minimal manipulation should be in the definition, and you can see some of the things that they thought might be helpful to a definition. In thinking about this issue of minimal manipulation, we actually use the products that are being developed for fecal microbiota transplants or to treat C. diff coming out of fecal microbiota transplants as a kind of a touchstone for this following schematic to indicate a spectrum along which products are increasingly manipulated. So you see on one end, the least manipulated end, we have basically donor stool that's transferred from a known donor in the clinical setting. And then on the most manipulated side, we have bacterial cocktail delivered in oral pill form. And so we think somewhere along this spectrum that there would be a line between what is a microbiota transplant and what constitutes a probiotic drug. The third issue that came up for our definition was whether the definition should include the concept of restoration or restoration to balance, or that microbiota transplant confers a health benefit on the host. So the concerns here were that the microbiome of the recipient may never have been in place, that it's impossible to measure restoration of the microbiome, that incorporating a health benefit would require clinical trials to demonstrate the health benefit. So we're still, we are meeting next in a few weeks actually, and this will be on our one of our topics to try to come up with a definition that addresses these issues. So at the beginning of that meeting, last meeting we had with the working group, we also began to identify some of the difficulties with regulation of fecal microbiota transplant as a drug or biologic, as FDA has proposed. So some of the issues that come up are that approval under an IND for biologic product requires the ability to characterize the therapeutic agent, and we haven't been able to do that yet for FMT. That clinical trials under an IND require consistency and makeup of the product from sample to sample. And again, that's quite challenging for the microbiota transplants. Also, approval under an IND doesn't address safety prior to use, post-approval, because that regulatory scheme doesn't require testing or screening prior to use, as do the other transplant regulatory paradigms. That approval under an IND doesn't address long-term safety, such as metabolic effects of the transplants. Also, that INDs encourage off-label use generally, and arguably the working group members thought that this was not really appropriate for FMT. And then finally, if these INDs ultimately result in granting someone a license for this product, they may have an exclusive arrangement to sell the approved product, which is often what happens when somebody gets approval as a drug or a license as a biologic. The problem is that you can't really exclude someone from using their stool to do this. So it raises the possibility of do it yourself or do it at home, and so Catherine Duff, who's a member of our working group and executive director of the Fecal Transplant Foundation, estimates that about 10,000 people do at-home fecal transplants in the U.S. each year. So we are looking to the other regulatory frameworks as possibilities for FMT, and currently think that maybe some hybrid approach might be applicable with elements of and maybe a few different frameworks. So just in terms of again, how this is challenging FDA. Again, they have changed their minds a number of times about, in a relatively short time, in terms of what how to regulate this. So in April of 2013, in response to an inquiry by a physician, the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research stated that fecal material is a biologic product and is a subcategory of drugs, and that physicians performing FMTs need to submit an IND application to FDA. Then there was kind of an uproar about that, and then in July of 2013, they issued a guidance document, and they agreed to exercise what they're calling enforcement discretion regarding IND requirements solely for C. diff, not responding to standard therapies. Then, in March of 2014, FDA published draft guidance, which they didn't finalize, where they said that the FMT product must be obtained from a donor known to either the patient or the physician, and that stool donors and stool must be qualified by screening and testing. So the first requirement there might prevent physicians from getting the material from stool banks, which are now in place in a number of settings. And then just last month, FDA issued draft guidance in which they revised and replaced the March 2014 guidance. And here they said that FMT may be used for recurrent C. diff if the FMT product is not obtained from a stool bank, and that stool banks must have an IND in place before distributing FMT product. Lastly, that the IND sponsor may request a waiver of certain IND requirements when giving FMT product to doctors treating patients with recurrent C. diff. And they're looking for comments on this last guidance document. So they are still clearly challenged by this and not quite sure what to do going forward. So just in conclusion, I'll just want to say a few things that I think maybe come out of both of these projects. And one is that the concept of promoting balance, which is what many probiotics claim to do, as well as maybe some microbiota transplants, is not part of the disease paradigm that has governed regulation of health-related products in this country for years. That under the disease paradigm, humans are healthy unless they have an illness, and that must be diagnosed and treated. So we don't have a measure for health, but rather the absence of disease. And this paradigm and the definitions that flow from it sweep into it in the drug category any products, including foods, that have a role in treating or preventing disease. And that projects, I think these projects raise a larger question of whether maybe some kind of alternative wellness paradigm would be a useful response to this category of therapies. And then lastly, I'll leave you with this kind of observation that I have is that FDA seems to want to push everything, the new products, into the drug category. And I wonder, do we lose anything by doing that? And this reminds me of, so where you deconstruct the material that is in the probiotic or in the microbiota transplant, those many organisms, into a few, of the book written by Michael Pollan that some of you probably read, Real Food. He talks about real food is what your grandmother made. But he also, he makes this comparison. Eating a carrot is not the same thing as eating beta-carotene. So with that, I'll end, and I will look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. Our faculty commentator is Dr. Francisco Diez-Gonzalez, who is department head and a professor of food safety microbiology in the Department of Food Science and Nutrition here at the University of Minnesota. His research focuses on the study and control of foodborne pathogens, with particular interests in the safety of organic foods, pathogens associated with fresh vegetables, we were talking about that last night at dinner, low water activity foods, and Hispanic foods. Among his many accomplishments, he's been a panel member for multiple USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture programs, as well as the National Research Council.
Thank you, Susan, for the nice introduction. And I want to thank, first of all, to Mike, Susan, and Alex for inviting me to provide a commentary for today's lecture. And I think it's an honor to be here today and comment on the outstanding lecture that Dr. Hoffmann had just delivered, and more than anything, to comment on her milestone effort that she's been pursuing in trying to dissect the complicated regulatory framework that exists related to probiotics, and now even more complicated with fecal transplantation. So I first of all, the first thing I want to say as commentary, please make sure that you read her reports from her working group that she referred during her presentation. You will get most of the of how difficult this task is. If you didn't get that message from her lecture, definitely it's a daunting task to trying to figure out the regulatory the rules and regulations related to this product. I want to say that my research itself includes very little related to probiotics and nothing related to fecal transplantation. But in the past, I did have a project in which we were working in our research group trying to find cholecystogenic E. coli that could inhibit E. coli 0157 when they were fed to cattle. 0157 is an organism that's been part of my interest, so that's the closest that I have related to probiotics. But I think it's an area that is fascinating. It's affecting currently our field in multiple fashions, in particular the field of food science. And right now we live in a time of multiple changes that affects the food industry. Probiotics is only one of them, and many other factors that are affecting the food industry is all of the different trends, consumer preferences that we're seeing, but I think just on the probiotic side, I think the advances that we've been referring to during this lecture series on the microbiome, the recent discoveries and the opportunities that have come up on the findings that the microbiome could offer regarding health promoting are enormous. So it's the focus on probiotics and fecal transplantation will continue to go on, but I think it's very interesting to see how the regulatory framework has had always, it's lagging behind whenever science is making progress. And I want to say an interesting fact right now is that probiotics have been around probably over a century with us. And one of the organisms that I've been interested for years is E. coli nasal 1917. This is probably one of the most successful commercial probiotics that existed in human history, and sometimes we do hear very little about it, but if you Google the internet, you could still find this product sold through the web as the name Mutaflor, and this was discovered in 1917. So it's been around for a long time. So, but right now we're facing major hurdles for the progress of an application of some of these technologies. Dr. Hoffmann did a pretty good job on addressing what are the issues still existing with probiotics regarding safety, the need for research that still exists, the issues that need to be addressed regarding any claims, and the fact that in this country, the claims is regulated by different federal agencies, and depending what kind of claims companies wants to make, and depending what kind of product they're making, as you know, as you learned today, I guess probiotics are related to, could be found to an array of different commercial products this day. So I think in summary, Dr. Hoffmann has provided a really nice framework that will hopefully help to guide some of our regulators in the short term and maybe in the future. And she has illustrated how our regulatory agencies sometimes are somewhat capricious, and they're going to change their position and their policies. So hopefully the work that she has done, she's been pioneering with her working group will actually help us to provide a better setting for our future policies on any of these products. So I think I wanted to keep my remarks relatively short so we have plenty of opportunity for discussion. The discussion part is when oftentimes you lead to more of the more learning than just listening to a single speaker. And especially in the case of Dr. Hoffmann, that she's bringing a wealth of experience and knowledge in this area. So I invite you to continue and stay for the conversation in the next few minutes. Thank you.
Can I actually first ask a question?
Yes.
So can I ask by show of hands, how many of you in the audience had some familiarity with the FDA regulations in this area? Okay, thank you.
I thought you were going to ask how many took probiotics.
This morning, yeah, or whatever.
Yeah, that's an interesting
Yeah.
question. Why don't you ask?
Yeah. How many have ever taken probiotics?
Fewer. Okay. Why don't we start over here if you'd introduce yourself.
My name is Dan Gallagher. I'm from the Department of Food Science of Nutrition, the same department where my good friend Francisco hails from. And I've, over the years, done a number of projects on prebiotics and probiotics. And so listening to your talk, it made me very happy that I work with animal models instead of humans, because FDA doesn't seem to care about people that have tails. And so that's an advantage. Thank you very much for your talk, for bringing me up to date on those regulations. The question I have regards the regulatory landscape for prebiotics, which produce essentially the same biological effects, at least in animal models. And so I was wondering if you'd be willing to comment on where that landscape lies right now.
I'm not as familiar with the prebiotics, and they're not live organisms, correct?
They are not.
Right,
No, by
so-
definition, they are indigestible carbohydrates.
And so, we'd have to ask the same question about how they're regulated would depend on, are they making, what is the intent for their use? Are they're used as a food, kind of a substrate, or as a supplement, or is it?
Yeah, they're used as a supplement primarily, and as I said, they're not live organisms, but they stimulate the growth in your large intestine of the same types of organisms that are the prebiotic organisms. So instead of giving the organism itself, you give food for those organisms, which preferentially cause things like bifidobacteria and lactobacillus to grow,
Right.
and therefore produce the biological effect.
And so would you see them making any kind of drug claims that taking prebiotics with probiotics can reduce, the incidence of disease? Because really, literally, that's what FDA is going to look at.
Right. I'm sure they would like to, because the science shows that they do produce the same effects. And this combination of pre and probiotics, which is sometimes referred to as symbiotic,
Right.
You're probably familiar with that, is a very powerful effect. And it does seem to be an actual synergy as opposed to an additive effect. So, but I'm actually, and you can buy it in many places. Inulin, fructooligosaccharides are sold as supplements at any.
And are you aware of any academic researchers or others who have, gone through an IRB for prebiotics for clinical trials?
I am not. I know of some studies that were done, and they did not do an IND giving to humans. I was peripherally involved in one of those, and so I'm not sure whether they should have. It was done some years ago,
Oh,
the
okay.
study, so it may have been before this became an issue.
Right. I think that a lot of studies were done before this.
Right.
And so that's that fermented milk study I mentioned. I think that seems to have been done.
Sort of the Steve Martin defense. I forgot.
So that might be my next NIH grant.
Yeah. I think it would be helpful.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Over here?
Good afternoon. My name is Rick Kingston. I'm a professor in the College of Pharmacy, and I'm also a principal in a national healthcare practice that does post-market medical surveillance for all kinds of companies, drugs, OTC drugs. Dietary supplements is probably the largest category that we actually monitor. We're academically affiliated with the university as well. So we have hundreds of companies in our portfolio, if you will. And many of these dietary supplement companies do have probiotics and prebiotics that we're actually monitoring from a safety perspective. So when you were talking about the safety issue, I thought that was really germane, because the framework right now with dietary supplements is that you not only have to report serious adverse events, but you have to document all adverse events so that you can determine whether or not it's serious. And so the unfortunate thing is the FDA only sees the serious ones, so that's tip of the iceberg. You've got a micro number of events that actually show up at the FDA. But the signaling is actually there by many of these companies, especially the ones that do a good job of trending and monitoring for effects. And so I see all these from multiple companies. And I think that the framework for monitoring the safety really lies in that post-market, because you're never going to get it in a pre-market study.
Right.
You know, as you know, if we're studying a relatively safe product and you have 1 in 10,000 people that is going to have a serious outcome or even a death, you have to study 30,000 patients before you can find that one with a 95% confidence interval. So from a safety perspective, I think the framework is there for supplements. Biggest issue there is FDA is just not enforcing. You know, we can't even get DMAA off the market with products that are sold on Amazon.com. So to come after companies for some of these minor infractions with discretionary enforcement, I think that's a big issue.
But it sounds like you raise a good point for me to kind of take back, that when we're thinking about a regulatory framework for either probiotics or microbiota transplants, we might want something in place that does measure or require more than just serious adverse events, but adverse events more broadly.
Yes, I think that's important. I'm also an adjunct professor at the University of Mississippi in their National Center for Natural Product Research, which is funded by the FDA. And one of the projects that we're underway with is actually taking a look at a stewardship program to bring supplement companies into a single environment where they not only share best practices and are identified as best practice companies, but they share information about adverse events in all types. So that might be a nice model, because those companies would actually be promoted to healthcare practitioners with a feedback loop in terms of what the experience is. So, you know, we can talk about that offline. A couple of other things real quick. When you're talking about doing studies and the inhibition of getting good research out there because studies are not being done on maybe supplements or probiotics because the concern about a disease endpoint, you know, we actually do a lot of studies on supplements that end up having a disease mitigation endpoint. The only issue is you can't use it on the label. Now, you can actually use it with the FTC, because FTC, they could care less what's on the label. They're only monitoring off-label information. And so as long as it's truthful and accurate, and they actually do an assessment, they typically don't take action. So I don't know if it seems like trying to get the FDA to change their process for allowing health claims is kind of like a tall target. So why not use the framework that you've got now in an existing loophole? And that kind of goes into the next part of that question, and I'd like you to respond to it, and that is when you're looking at health claims, even FDA has loosened up their requirements in terms of if you have national authoritative bodies where there's a consensus on certain health claims, you can make those kinds of claims. So maybe the national bodies need to get more involved in identifying some of the most basic claims that we can make. Let the companies use it in off-label for FTC type of off-label types of claims and use that as a springboard. So I'll let you comment on that, and then I have one final comment.
Well, no, we have so many people. Let's stop there, because there'll be time to talk after and see what our speakers have to say about all those issues.
I'll sit down then.
Okay.
I think those are actually quite good ideas. I mean, the one about that this data is available, and I think in both the probiotics and the microbiota transplants, we're trying to think about ways to capture not only indications of safety, but also efficacy. We're looking at whether there's some kind of registry or something that can be done. And I think your second idea is also worthy of consideration. So thank you.
Great. Over here.
All right. Hi. I'm Sophia Strasberg. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Geography over on West Bank. And I did my master's project on the relationship between humans and helminths in terms of patients who are using them for their DIY healing of Crohn's disease or mitigation of the symptoms of Crohn's disease. And now I'm looking more at fecal matter transplant and gut bacteria, and I'm developing my project still. But I am also working on, as part of a collaborative with the Institute for Advanced Study next year, about global pharmaceutical economies and other social concerns. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more, it's a more general question rather than a technical one, but talk a little bit more about how some of the choices that are right now in front of the FDA, concerning especially the pharmaceutical side, but maybe also the probiotic side, might have a different impact on, or different economic impacts. So does the FDA take some economic impacts into account when they're making these regulations? I mean, maybe this is a tricky question because it's saying, it's not just ethical. Perhaps there are some economic aspects also coming into play here. And I'm curious if people in the FDA are speaking to that, or in your group are thinking about how, deciding on one regulatory framework over another one might change the economy, and then also how that might relate to what's going on in other countries with their regulations. Like, is there a game of catch-up between the United States and other countries in terms of if they allow for pharmaceutical companies to be manufacturing this drug more easily, or for probiotics to be less regulated, say, then should the U.S. follow suit because we're going to end up behind? So that is my question.
Okay, so but the economy, do you mean pricing? Are you talking about the high costs of drugs, or I'm not sure when you say the economy.
I know, I'm not being too specific, I suppose. I guess, I
don't think that FDA does take that into account. I mean, they're really looking
pricing,
at safety
also,
and efficacy.
Right, the amount of money that can be dedicated to the research, or that, the funding possibilities that might be going in. So they're pretty able to remain separated from that.
I think so.
Okay.
I mean, every agency has its politics, but I think that's generally not, certainly legally, that part of their framework, that one of the things that they're supposed to consider. Your question about, do we look at other countries, or, I just wanted to share that very interesting distinction between how the United States regulates health claims and the European Union. So the European Union has been much more stringent. So they don't have something like structure function claims there, where they can, in the United States, you can make those without pre-market approval. They don't have that there. So they don't actually even allow products on the market that say they are probiotics in their label, because that implies a health claim, because the definition confers a health benefit. So that's much more stringent than we have here. And I don't think we're likely to go that direction. So there are definitely differences between how countries are regulating, but I think these regulators talk to each other, but each one has a kind of a different mindset, I think.
Francisco, did you want to?
Yeah, I just want to comment, I guess, your question about the economics. I don't know if you were, I kind of understand maybe that were the economic consequences of policy making. That's because, and I think I would say probably FDA doesn't purposely do it, but I think in the process of asking for comments from stakeholders whenever they're going to enact a regulation, that allows the possibility for bringing anyone interested in the topic to comment whether what's going to be the consequence, but I'm not sure if they have a built-in process to evaluate the economic consequences. Now, going back to the commentary for other countries, what we did learn as a result of this European ban of the term probiotics, the market dropped incredible. If you look at the numbers of just yogurt consumption, probiotic yogurt consumption in the European Union, it dropped in the last couple of years. So that's, you can see that how, that's a really good case study for a direct impact of a policy on the specific market.
Is the European position based on scientific skepticism about what you get from probiotics?
I think so. They want them to submit substantiation for any claims they're making. And because they have tended to make broad claims about wellness and health, and they don't necessarily have the evidence to substantiate that.
So have the American regulators not been skeptical enough?
Well, I think it lies in our current laws and regulatory frameworks where, I mean, the statutes that are in place actually have, carved out this exception for dietary supplements and structure function claims. So that's the big difference.
The rationale for banning the word probiotics in the European Union is because the definition inherently implies a health benefit. That's why they decided to completely eliminate it.
And their view is that's not yet demonstrated? Uh-huh. Dan?
Hi, I'm Dan Knights. I'm in the computer science department in the Biotech Institute. I study the gut microbiome and human disease. And I'm wondering about, we talked about the potential loophole with dietary supplements. I'm wondering about another loophole that regards the definition of a strain and how much the FDA is really thinking about that. Because any two strains of, say, Lactobacillus reuteri are different. I mean, even a single mutation can make the difference between what it's able to do. So are they thinking about that? Do you have to characterize the exact strain and it has to be identical every time you produce it and administer it? Because if not, here's an example, then potentially you could take FMTs that contained a particular strain-ish sort of thing, like species, maybe within 99% genome identity, and show that that species was administered successfully to hundreds or thousands of patients with no adverse effects. And could that information be used as safety evidence to support the use of that bug on its own, even if it were not the exact same strain that was in the FMT?
You're getting into some of the issues about characterization and what's required by FDA, and we're still not scientifically, I think, at a point where we can characterize it sufficiently. I mean, I think they are concerned to the extent that we can identify strains. I think they want that information at the strain level. But again, in terms of identifying the therapeutic agent, I think they, again, there's something that may be relevant to the community of organisms. Although I also understand that there are some companies actually that have just started that have tried to pull out some of the microorganisms. That's my issue about deconstruction and the carrot. And so I think there are some that are in clinical trials looking at that.
So as it stands currently, if I grow up my own Lactobacillus reuteri and I show using what I think are good scientific methods to show that it is that bug, am I automatically admitted to the whole, whatever all of the claims are that are already approved for that bug, even though it's not the same strain that was used in the studies?
I'm not sure how FDA is treating that yet. So that's a good question.
And you haven't heard of anyone trying to use FMT as evidence of safety of bugs, even though it's, if a bug is going in the community.
Right, no, I haven't heard anybody.
Probably different than on its own. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, interesting questions, thank you.
Well, my name's Tom Way, and I'm coming from the other side. I had a liver and a kidney transplant 7 months ago tomorrow, and I'm just wondering if I should be taking probiotics or not. The anti-rejection drugs are to inhibit my immune system. I'm wondering if the probiotics would counteract that or if they would be compatible with it.
So I'm not a physician, so I can't give you advice, and I really think that that's the kind of thing that you need to discuss with your physician if there's anything. Because I think it's also, you can't just say a probiotic. They are all different and have different kinds of microorganisms.
I know what else I was wondering which one.
Yeah, and that's a whole problem with this industry, as I see it anyway, because there's not requirements for substantiation of claims or efficacy.
Yeah, because I asked my doctor about it, and he said, well, one once in a while wouldn't hurt you, but I wouldn't take them regularly. So I'm kind of up in the air, I don't know. And then also, since they're live organisms,
You want to comment?
Yeah, Dr. Koretz, yeah.
Do you want to go to a mic, Alex, and comment?
Hi.
Well, I'm going to let Dr. Koretz comment on that last question first.
Sure. I see a lot of patients with complications from antibiotics. Some of them are organ transplant patients. I have no problem making a clear statement. Probiotics will not help you. None of the existing products will, there's absolutely no evidence they would do any good, and there's no theoretical evidence they could. In addition, you're immunosuppressed. So there is a certain risk in taking a microbe that might be alive, that as you take it down your mouth and it travels down, it could penetrate through your intestinal tract and cause an infection. So I don't think it makes much sense to put much faith in any existing probiotic products.
So let me follow up on that. How do we put together Alex's comments on we don't really have good evidence that these are helpful products with all this action going on the regulatory front to try and get a blessing for these products? There seems to be a gap here. What's going on?
Well, I think the FDA would like to require substantiation for these claims. And they have, their hands are tied at this point. They don't have the statutory authority to do that. So they, as I said, the FTC could do more in terms of advertising and claims. And they have taken some actions against some companies for claims, some big actors in the food area, Nestle's and a subsidiary of Nestle's and Danone. And I think they're hoping that this will reduce these kinds of claims that don't have sufficient substantiation.
So are you saying that if somehow they can wedge probiotics into the drug category, then they can examine the claims, and then they can say there's some basis, there's no basis, forget it, whatever. But if they're stuck in the supplements category, they can't do that.
Right, right. And
that's what's at stake.
Right. And so the FDA can't do it. I mean, unless they kind of go over the line and are making a health claim that does require pre-approval, which they're not doing that generally because it does require FDA approval. And then if FDA basically has to say you're going beyond a structure function claim here, and then you should be in the IND category.
And so for FDA to do that, they need a statute? They need a new statute?
Yeah, the law would have to be changed.
They can't.
They can enforce more. They can enforce more.
Okay.
Right. But that's an issue. Actually, I didn't list this in the publications, but I'm in the process of an article coming out on a private right of action under FTC for unsubstantiated claims, health-related claims.
Okay. Yes.
Hi, Peter Bell, pharmacist. Quick, snappy question. What is the success rate or otherwise for FMT regarding specifically C. difficile? Do you know what the percentage success rate is?
I know it's over 90%, but again, I think Dr. Koretz.
You're going to put Dr.
Anecdotally, I know one person that's had repeated treatments with no success or limited success.
Yes, so the experience seems to be fairly consistent across different practices with minor variations, but roughly it's 90%. So that means 1 out of 10 will fail. In my practice, I've done about 400. There's a handful that have repeatedly failed. We're working up there, what is the reason for that? Is it a problem with engraftment of these microbes? Is there some problem with the host characteristics? Or even if do they have a different kind of C. diff? We have some preliminary evidence that the third possibility may actually be true, and the C. diff may already be figuring out a way around fecal transplant. We can't underestimate the power of evolution. And, just like any drug, if there is a treatment and it's widespread use, there could be a way out of it.
So, Diane, you were just talking about the FDA's hands being somewhat tied in evaluating probiotics, but that's not true with FMT, right?
No. Mm-mm.
Because FMT is being pioneered and researched as an actual treatment
Exactly.
for a medical condition. So that they're fully able to evaluate safety, efficacy.
It's just that the drug paradigm or the IND framework there, it never envisioned this type of therapy. The traditional chemical or based drug is different from a live microorganism or a community of microorganisms. This really is what is unique about microbiota transplants.
And what do we have by way of oversight tools if we were to just say, we're going to look at this as a transplant?
Okay, so
Would that help?
Certainly it would help for screening and testing for communicable diseases before.
In the donor.
Because that's not a part of the drug paradigm. So I think we want to have something like that as a regulatory requirement. FDA has mentioned that in its most recent guidance document. So it's kind of experimenting a bit with the IND and making some add-ons to it. So they're trying to modify a pathway that wasn't really customized for this. I mean, they're trying to customize it more, I think.
Because I think the FDA has asserted jurisdiction over gamete transfer, donor gamete.
Right.
So
Yeah.
awkwardly, that may be a precedent for them looking at.
Well, we are looking at, the framework for human tissues and cells, blood products, cord blood, which also seem to have some things that we might want to incorporate for these kind of microbiota transplants.
Okay. Yes.
Very nice talk. My name is Doug Mashek. I'm a faculty in biochemistry and medicine. And you brought something up which we kind of know, but you reminded us that our microbiome is shared with those around us. And when we currently test drugs for efficacy and safety, we give them to an individual and test that individual. So I'm just wondering, moving forward, is the FDA going to be considering when we get to this point of again, efficacy and safety of probiotics, prebiotics, fecal transplants, of looking not only at the individual receiving that, but those around them?
But people around them, okay.
Yes.
So when I gave that example, I haven't heard them talk about that yet, but I think that's, again, something that maybe deserves some focus and that our working group might want to consider. So thank you for that suggestion as well.
That raises an additional question, which is IRBs and whether they're really equipped to oversee, evaluate, and then oversee the research in this domain. Have you looked at those issues? Because this third-party exposure question can be a real challenge for IRBs.
Well, I mean, again, even if they don't require an IND, if it's clinical research, it needs to go through an IRB, and they need to evaluate it like they would any other human clinical trial, and ensure informed consent and look at the risks. And that's where I think at some point, initially the IRBs weren't saying that this research needed an IND, and then when they've got wind from FDA, and so they began to say you have to go to FDA and for a determination of whether you need an IND. But yeah, I'm not sure how they will deal with this third-party issue in terms of risk.
The question that Alex raised about, and that you elaborated on about, is there efficacy here? To what extent is public enthusiasm and the internet and the fact that you can go to Walgreens and buy all this stuff on the shelf driving the bus?
Well, again, I think that a lot of that was present when Congress passed the Dietary Supplement Health Education Act in 1994. I just went, in 1995, I spent a year on Capitol Hill working with my state senator, Senator Mikulski, and it was, that had just been passed, and that was very much a kind of consumer-driven initiative where I think there were a lot of celebrities that testified in Congress about don't take my vitamins and supplements away, They had a mass, like mailing, somebody was telling me that for some reason they sent in their mailings on paper plates. They wrote on them, "Don't take my supplements away." So there is a big consumer group that really advocated for this and was very concerned that FDA might otherwise regulate this area so that it would be like drugs and they wouldn't be able to get access to them.
Okay. Let's take one last question.
Hi, my name is Mark Scipione.
Could you speak up, please?
Sure. My name is Mark Scipione. I'm wondering, do you think it ever may happen that in standard medical practice, when the administration of a certain treatment results in the, I'll use a colloquial term, trashing of the microbiome, there will be paired with that an automatic resort to something that attempts to restore a microbiome? I'm thinking of, antibiotics used for a great deal of, pretty much everything these days. And so perhaps the matchup of what looks to be a restorative thing would be more of an automatic match when something is done that hurts the microbiome.
I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
Okay. Well, people who are on a course of antibiotics, that impacts their microbiome, their digestive microbiome. And as I understand it, it sort of just takes it down. I mean, it just kind of takes it down. And so what we're talking about is something that restores, I think that's the right word, or brings back or whatever, perhaps faster than, or more completely, or whatever the right way to think about it is, than plan B, whatever that is, just roll ahead. And so is there a logic that may well be adopted sometime to pairing the use of antibiotics to something that does something to restore what's being destroyed in the process?
Yes, I understand. And
Thank you.
Yes, and I think Dr. Koretz is probably the best.
We're giving Alex exercise this morning. Okay.
No, actually, so, I mean, as an answer to that, certainly the developers are thinking that possibility. Right now, FMT is a last resort treatment for ultimate complications of antibiotic treatment that's refractory to anything else. But perhaps, but actually to extend that question, all of these health claims are kind of phony, and they invoke the word balance. But this actually would be something that rebalances back to normal. So it's not really, disease hasn't happened. The patient took an antibiotic. Nothing happened yet. They probably will recover. But why take the risk? Why have this unbalanced system now? All I want to do is restore balance. Would that be kind of put the FMT back into the probiotic category? Yeah, actually, so the question was asked about that once. In that infamous workshop of FDA in 2013, there was a trial which is already in progress. So these are patients undergoing bone marrow transplant. They get carpet bomb with antibiotics. That's standard therapy. And a lot of them get C. diff infections, and worse than that, they get bloodborne infections. It's all complications of antibiotic therapy. So a natural idea was, why don't we autobank their microbiota before, and then they go through a transplant, we give it back. So they asked that question of the FDA. Is that a drug? It's a self-auto, and there was a tortured kind of pause. And then she imagined this material coming out and somehow being packaged, and said, well, it came out and you manipulated it, and so now it's a drug. So it went through the IND. The trial is in progress, so it was delayed by about 2 years for all the paperwork. So the answer of the FDA at the moment was that it's a drug. But perhaps they were trying to prevent clear clinical endpoints of C. diff infection, bloodborne infections. That's one thing. But the question was raised, I just want to restore balance. The nebulous health claim, which
That
clearly
would be a structure
antibiotic
function claim, probably.
Right, the structure function claim. Can that be done?
Yeah, I mean.
So we're near our end of our time, so what's the
say?
answer?
Well, the question I thought was also, could there be a probiotic that restores balance after antibiotics?
No, a probiotic doesn't do that. but FMT would.
Okay.
So can that be the probiotic that actually fulfills the structure function claim?
Oh, okay, yes, so through an FMT, could we make a structure function claim rather than a drug claim? And yeah, theoretically, yes. I've been trying to think actually about that for our project. Could we, is there another way? Could we ever identify microbiota transplants in any way as something not a drug, but more like a dietary supplement, because it's going to make, not going to make a drug claim. But, I mean, it's also different than probiotics, because probably we're not going to put it on the shelf and make claims like that. I mean, I could be wrong. I don't know.
Sure we can.
Oh, we can? Okay, well, if we can, then it's going to be based on what you want to say in the claim. Yeah, so that's an argument I would make if I was your lawyer with FDA.
So the good news is that for those of you who are staying for the invitational lunch, we can keep talking. Alex is going to graciously moderate our lunch conversation, and for those of you who are staying, it's one floor up. This is the third floor. It's on the fourth floor in Campus Club rooms B and C, and our wonderful staff will be out there to make sure you don't go astray. I just want to thank not only our wonderful speakers, but also Alex and Mike Sadowski, who's teaching diligently and so unable to be here this morning, for spearheading this wonderful, wonderful lecture series. So join me in thanking all.